Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do a wrap-up of science fiction and fantasy I've been reading recently. I gotta say, it's been a rough start to the year in terms of quality. Quantity-wise has been great, but in terms of seeking that illustrious 5-star read, I'm still waiting on it. And I gotta say, I'm getting impatient, but I still have some good books to recommend to you all, some new releases that you probably want to hear my opinions on. So all that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about Empire of Silence by Christopher Ruocchio, which is the first book in the Sun Eater series. And this is one that I recently talked about in my spring TBR, because yes, I am catching up on the series in preparation for the 4th book to come out this spring. And I wanted to share it all with you, at least in terms of my thoughts so far. This story follows a man named Hadrian, and the story is told in a chronicle style where he's looking back on his life. We're reading his written chronicle of what happened to him, and this story is set in the far-flung future on a different planet. At the beginning of the story, we start out by following him with his family. It essentially starts as a coming-of-age narrative, and then it follows him as he goes through the years and everything that happened to him that made him the man that he became, the legend that he is known for by the end of this chronicle. Now, at this point in time of filming, I've only read the first book, The Empire of Silence, and I will say that I liked it, but I'm really glad that I picked it up when I was in the mood for a fantasy story, because even though, yes, technically this is science fiction, I'm going to argue that this is definitely sci-fantasy, or the kind of science fiction that I would recommend to those of you that like fantasy. Because in terms of the narrative structure, as I mentioned, it's a coming-of-age story, and then it's also a chronicle story that is much more common to read about in fantasy. So yes, it does have science fiction elements to it. They talk about different in vitro and different technologies that exist. And again, it's in the future, it's on different planets, there's space travel. But beyond those elements, I'll be honest, I could have forgotten that I was reading a story set in space because it felt like I was reading a fantasy story instead. Now, overall, I will say I enjoyed this one. The prose is very nice. The author has a really eloquent way of speaking without it getting too flowery, but I was not completely blown away by this book. And I think it's just for the fact that this first book is so much set up, because it really starts off the character where he needs to begin, because in order to have this amazing story where he grows through the ranks and becomes a legend, he first needs to almost have a fall and to really start from nothing. And so the book was a little bit predictable. I also did not worry for the character because, again, the way that the book is structured, you know that he survives long enough to write this tale. And so every time something terrifying was potentially happening to him, I didn't have any suspense because I knew he was going to be fine. And in turn, I just assumed that everyone else around him was going to die in order to create drama. And so I will say that I didn't love this book as much as I wanted to, but I'm very eager to continue on with the later books. I've heard that they just get better and that the criticisms of the first book kind of go away because I just wasn't in love with where we were spending time in the story. But again, I assume that the stakes are going to grow with each book and the character is going to move along to greater and bigger things. So if you have read further in the series, please don't spoil anything, but I'd love to hear your opinions if you think that I will enjoy these later books even more. Very excited to catch up to the release date. And I'm just eager to see what is coming next in this iconic series. Next, I want to talk about The Chosen 12 by James Breakwell. This is a book that I received from Rebellion Publishing for review. And this story follows a group of colonists, the last group of this ship that was sent off to colonize this other planet. However, something went wrong. The robots, or AI, went rogue, and now these young colonists have to survive. I was very much intrigued by the premise, which is why I requested the book, but unfortunately, I would say that the execution of this one really fell flat for me. I did not love the characters. I found the plot and the narrative structure to be very disjointed and not very enjoyable to read. And I admit that I didn't find the writing itself to be very strong. So I hate to give such a negative review, but I will always be honest. The reason I continue to pick up books from this publisher is that they do really creative and innovative things with their science fiction fantasy. But unfortunately, with that, sometimes it's a hit and it's amazing new favorite, and sometimes it's a big miss, which is the case here. Next up, we have Ancestral Night by Elizabeth Bear, and this follows Salvagers in a future where they have developed what they call white space technology, allowing them to move very quickly through space without exceeding the rules of space travel or light speed. And so within the story, the Salvagers discover this ancient technology and things spiral from there. I will say that this sounds like a very classic tropey space opera, and in some ways it is, but in other ways it felt very fresh. I think that Elizabeth Bear has a great talent when it comes to writing. I found her writing to be very approachable, so it is a story that I could easily put in the hands of someone who is newer to science fiction, but at the same time it still felt very smart and very well written. I think that she brings some good humor into her stories. There's a lot of jokes surrounding cats, and so if you're a cat person, I think you'll especially enjoy this one. And again, it does fall into a lot of those tropes, but for some reason I did not mind it here. I like the characters, I like the writing, I enjoyed spending time in the story. My experience of reading it was overall just a good one. However, if I'm honest, I will say that the details of the plot were not particularly interesting to me, and as I spend more time away from this novel, the details honestly have faded in my mind. So I did not completely love this one, but I enjoyed enough aspects of it that I would recommend it to those of you that are interested in it, those of you that love space opera, something fresh, something new, and something, like I said, a little bit funny. So this is the first book in the White Space series. I've already read the companion book, Machine, which I personally prefer just because I thought it had a stronger plot with more of a mystery, but this one definitely still delivered. It just, for whatever reason, wasn't quite as good as I wanted it to be. Next up, I want to talk about Orbital Cloud, which is a story translated from Japanese. And in the story, we follow a whole bunch of different characters. And one of them at the beginning of the story discovers that there is some sort of orbital debris in space. And with that, they start to uncover this larger plot because possibly there is a weapon or something that a government or some body is trying to keep hidden. And the story really goes from there. So this is written as a science fiction thriller. And unfortunately, I didn't find it as thrilling as I wanted it to be. I didn't completely just love this one. The characters were not particularly interesting, but I went into this one knowing that it wasn't supposed to be a character-driven story, and I was okay with that. But the plot itself also fell flat, and I just didn't love all the aspects in the story. The biggest strength of this novel, in my opinion, is the hard science. I really enjoyed the discussions around orbital mechanics, which apparently is like one of my buzzwords. So I like the science in the story, but the threads around it, the actual story, the plot, the characters were all just okay, very average, and left me unfortunately really underwhelmed. This is a book I've been dying to read for years. I had it on my Amazon wish list, and my husband got it for me for Christmas because I've never had the chance to read it before. So I was incredibly disappointed to have gotten it as a gift only to find it just okay. And this is why I typically like to buy books that I've already read, but again, I had no other way to get this book, so that is what happened. So yeah, overall a big disappointment here. And finally, for science fiction, I read The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, and this story follows an anthropologist who goes off to another planet where they have very different ideas of gender based off of their biology and their cultural ideas surrounding it. And so within the story, we get to learn how the different genders are approached within this other culture and alien race. We find out that for the most part, these beings appear to be asexual or lacking sexual organs, and so only when they go to actually couple with someone else do they get different organs and procreate, and then they go back to this non-gendered state. And I really like this book because given when it was written, I thought that it had some really progressive ideas in it, and of course I've been really eager to finally read some Ursula K. Le Guin. So I will say that in terms of the representation, I was very impressed. I of course am not a non-binary person or a trans person, so I can't comment on some of the representation from an own voice's perspective, but from my limited point of view, I thought it was very nuanced and very interesting. In some ways it got very info dumpy, but I am someone who just loves to learn more about an alien culture, an idea, things like that, so I just lapped it all up. The plot itself I found to be a little bit thin, and I didn't find myself as connected to the story, the characters, and everything as I would have liked, but I was glad to have finally read some Ursula K. Le Guin, and I definitely want to read more. I think I'm going to go with the Dispossessed as my next read from her, so do let me know if you have a different recommendation. But I'm finally happy to say that I've at least read something by this iconic female science fiction author. Now, switching over to fantasy, I do have a few books to talk about, and the first one is Engines of Empire by R.S. Ford. This is a new release out from Orbit Books, and I was very eager to check this one out from the synopsis. Essentially, it's a multi-point of view story told in a fantasy world where they have technology, so it's almost in a steampunk type setting, but all of this technology is fueled by magic. And so as someone who really enjoys scientific ideas and technology blended into my fantasy, I was very eager to check this one out, and I will say that I really enjoyed that concept. When I saw it on the page, when I saw the use of the magic, pushing the cart forward and things like that, I very much enjoyed it. Unfortunately, the actual characters, the story, the plot, you can probably guess where I'm going with this, kind of fell flat for me. I thought they were just very average, and despite having a really cool premise to the story, everything else about this just felt like a very traditional, classic fantasy narrative. And not that that is a bad thing, but I've said before that when I look for fantasy, I look for something a little bit special, a little bit different, and this book just felt oh so normal and oh so average, and I just wanted more from it. So unfortunately it didn't entirely deliver for me, but I'm definitely glad that I got a chance to read it. I think if you enjoy really classic fantasy, you will probably enjoy this one more than I did. Next up, we have Servant Mage by Kate Elliott, and this is a Tor.com fantasy novella. The story follows a young servant who is sent off to go on this big epic quest, and essentially it is an epic fantasy story told in a really small package. I will say that it is really tropey. It is very predictable. If you're used to reading a lot of standard fantasy, you're going to know where the story is going to go. It was enjoyable to read, but I wanted more from this. So I am finding that I am someone who, if you're going to pick up an epic fantasy, I want it to be in an epic size package, because I think I would have loved the story a lot more if it had had several hundred more pages. And again, it was very traditional and really didn't do anything to innovate or twist around the tropes in a way that I would have found more interesting. So overall, I would say if you love fantasy, if you love traditional classic fantasy, you will undoubtedly love this one more than I did. And my biggest complaint about it is just that I wanted it to be longer, and that's just something I'll have to know going into future novellas, that when it comes to epic fantasy, I'm probably going to prefer something that's over 500 pages. From there, I read Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lynn Tan, and this follows a girl whose mother stole an elixir from the gods and became a god themselves. And within the story, the daughter has to run off and protect herself, ends up going to the capital of the gods, getting pulled in with the prince, and together they form a relationship. And I will say I was very excited for this one because it was described as Asian inspired fantasy, and it is, and I really did love those world building elements to the story. However, this is also heavily focused on the romance, and to a degree that I did not enjoy. I enjoy steamy scenes within a book, but I do not enjoy the romance that surrounds it. And this book was all the will they, won't they, does he like her, does she like him? And I just did not care about that. I felt like the actual plot became a backdrop to the romance, and this is a duology, so I am tempted to finish it out when the second book comes out, just because again I can see the conclusion to the story. But I thought this book was really disappointing because I wanted so much more from it. It was a book I really hyped up and hoped that would be a new favorite, and unfortunately that is not the case. Super disappointing. And finally, we have The Gutter Prayer, which is the first book in an epic fantasy trilogy. And this is a story told over 3 perspectives. At the beginning of the story, we follow these thieves that are trying to pull off a job. Something goes wrong, a bomb goes off, and the 3 of them get separated and go in different directions. Some of them are caught, some of them may escape, and the story goes from there. I've often said that I'm not a huge character-driven reader. However, I've got to say that the character work in this was amazing. I loved all 3 character perspectives, and I love them equally, which is not something I usually can say when it comes to multi-POV stories. Normally there is one perspective that keeps me reading, and then I tolerate the other ones. But in this case, I love the main human perspective, as well as her ghoulish companion, which added some good creepiness to the story. And then there's also a third companion who has this stone disease where his skin is turning to stone, and that was incredibly interesting. It reminded me a lot of the grayscale disease from the Song of of Ice and Fire series, so if you like that aspect, you will definitely find something similar here. And I just liked the world building in this. It felt so unique. Again, a little bit dark, a little bit creepy. I wouldn't say that this is horror by any means, but again, when you have ghoul characters that are needing to eat flesh and meat, and you have this character that is turning to stone and the ramifications of that, it just plays with some really creative and dark ideas, and I loved it. So again, this is the kind of fantasy I cannot get enough of because it's just different. It kept me turning the pages, it kept me immersed. I was dealing with a lot of really crazy stuff in my personal life that was really distracting, and this book helped me to escape from that and completely pulled me in. I've only read the first book at this point, but I definitely plan to continue on and finish out the trilogy as soon as I can get my hands on the later books. Absolutely love this, and definitely has potential to end up on my favorites at the end of the year because I cannot stop thinking about this book. And again, it's only the first in this trilogy, so I can't wait to see where the story is going to go from here. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to hear of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out, and maybe which ones are you planning on skipping. I would also love for you to recommend me new books to read because again, I'm still chasing that 5-star perfect read for 2022, so help a girl out. If you are new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of adult science fiction, fantasy, horror, and thrillers. You can help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online, dropping a comment, even if it's just a little emoji, and if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss another video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.